Hi guys, and welcome back to the UK's human landscape. Today we are looking at urban decline, and we're looking at a cycle of how a lack of investment, deindustrialization, and a variety of other factors can combine and contribute to worsening outcomes for local people, the local economy, and society in general. So, looking at this definition of urban decline, then, the deterioration of a city as a result of poor maintenance and a lack of investment. What do we really mean by this? What we're saying here is that an area is getting worse. Okay, the quality of that area is getting worse. Instead of improving and getting nicer and nicer, it's getting worse. So, what I want you to start me off with then is just as many examples of what you might see in an area that has experienced decline. So, this image here is to sort of spark those thoughts for a moment. Pause the video. What kinds of things do you expect to see in an area that is declining? It's gotten a lot worse. Okay, so you've had a moment to think about that. Hopefully, you've got a couple of examples. Let's see what we've got here in the image. We've got, say, for instance, this broken fence. You've got piles of rubbish on the street. Perhaps you've got something that's being knocked down. Some other examples of things that we might find in an area that has experienced decline then. So we've got smashed windows. This is a really common thing, particularly where an area is not being looked after. People maybe have had to give up property, are no longer living or renting buildings, smashed windows, abandoned cars, broken pavements or walls. Effectively, what we're saying is nobody's looking after these things or maintaining them. You might find empty buildings. If the local industry is shut down and local shops are not getting enough business, they're going to close up and no one's necessarily going to be renting those buildings anymore. So you start to get boarded up buildings, and along with that, then there's a lack of investment in the local things that you would expect to see on a street. This word might be new to you here, street furniture. It's to refer to all of the things that you see on a street that very often the local council or local government maintains. It's things like the bins, the benches, your fences, your lampposts, all that stuff that just makes that shared or communal space on the street a little bit nicer. Where an area is wealthy, it's got lots of investment in the local area, you might see them putting up Christmas lights, repainting things, making sure things are being taken care of. But in an area that's going through a period of decline, these are the kinds of things that get let go. People forget about them. We might see a lot of peeling paint. We might see a huge amount of graffiti, perhaps, where maybe the police are not patrolling as much, people are not taking as much care of their area. You find a lot more litter and a lot more graffiti. Now, graffiti is not always a bad thing. You might see in some areas, particularly where they've gone through a period of urban decline, and then after that, a period of regeneration where they get much nicer and investment starts coming back, you start to see the graffiti going from being just tags and things like that to being a real creative expression for that community and a real sign of its rejuvenation. We might also see things like overgrown gardens, the edge, a bit of grass at the edge of a road, local parks, that kind of thing. They become overgrown because no one is maintaining them or there's not enough investment into maintenance. So, in a previous lesson, I asked you to complete this homework where we were looking at urban decline in London's Docklands. So, you were asked to find two photos, or four photos rather, two of what London's Docklands looked like before the decline and two after. If you haven't done this homework, please do it now. Okay, it's a good bit of research for you to do independently. You have access to the internet, and I think you'll find out some really interesting bits of history about the decline of the East End of London and the Docklands in particular. The second thing I asked you to do was to use some bullet points or a spider diagram and summarize the information that's here in this text. But I'm going to go through the sort of story now for you of the London Docklands. So, London's Docklands are a really, really key part of London's history, and its role in world trade. By 1880, the empire at its peak, London's docks were a hub for world trade. They were the busiest in the world. And until the outbreak of the Second World War, the sheds and warehouses that were along the River Thames housed every conceivable commodity and welcomed sailors from all over the British Empire. So here we see a sign that shows the Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi Seamen's Club. So that's welcoming sailors from other parts of the British Empire. In this image up here, we see an ivory warehouse. You can see the tusks that are here and the pieces of ivory that we used in all kinds of different things. Now, during the Second World War, London was a huge target for the Blitz, and one of the things that they were really targeting, the Luftwaffe were really targeting, were London's warehouses, because that was where we were bringing in supplies from across the world, across the empire, from our allies across the Atlantic. And they knew that hitting that trade would be a really, really important thing. So because it was so strategically important to the UK, these trading hubs in the Docklands, they launched a huge attack, a daylight raid. And what's really interesting is that in the Thames itself, they built these structures in the river, standing there with these huge anti-aircraft guns on top to protect the Docklands area and the warehouses surrounding it. So they've been taken down now. They're no longer there. You can see them in the Museum of London Docklands if you ever get the opportunity to visit. But these huge towers that were put up in the river, so it's a really, really important spot. If we look at this image over here, where this guy's shoveling something, it might look like he's shoveling dirt, but in fact, that was a sugar warehouse that had been bombed. And in this image, he's shoveling the sugar to try and see what they can rescue or retain, because as you might already know, the Second World War came with a whole host of challenges, but in particular, for people back in the UK, it came with a huge amount of rationing as shortages of food and other supplies really kicked in. After the Second World War, though, the Docklands went through a period of decline and regeneration. The decline is pretty much the same thing that happened in the Industrial Revolution, but at a later scale. The modernisation that we've previously said led to a decline in agriculture is now starting to hit the trades in the cities. And the modernisation of the docks in particular involves these perfectly rectangular boxes. Now, this is the start of containerization, having exactly standard containers that ships could load and unload from anywhere in the world. But because of the standardization of this and the use of cranes, rather than using barrels and boxes, there's much less need for humans to roll things on and off. The dock workers themselves were not required to unload the ships. And more than that, because of the cranes taking up so much space and the size of the ships getting bigger, they needed more space than they had in the old traditional docks of London. And so what they did was they said, fine, we'll move the docks further downriver towards the sea where there's a lot more space in the estuary. So they moved the docks out there, and that meant there were huge job losses in the east of London, where people had traditionally worked in the docks. And as they closed and moved to new facilities, people lost their jobs. Now, this period of decline lasts for quite a while. From the 1960s and the 1980s, almost all the docks are closed. And then in the late 1980s, the east of London, particularly the Docklands, becomes Europe's big regeneration project. That word regeneration is really key for this unit. It tells us that an area that has gone downhill, it's gone into decline, is now having money and investment pumped into it to try and bring it back up. And it's not about recreating exactly what happened in the past, but trying to bring in a new industry. In this case, it's London's budding financial centre. And this building here, which many people know as Canary Wharf, but is actually called 1 Canada Square, at the time it was built, was a sort of figurehead for this regeneration. It became a symbol of how much the area had transformed, because don't forget, this area of London, even a few years ago, is amongst the most deprived areas in the whole of the UK. This symbol of Canada Square was at the time Europe's tallest building. It houses a huge number of banks and other organisations today, and it is now part of London's global financial hub. So back to your homework then, thinking about why did London's Docklands fall into decline? What were some of the reasons that we had in that article that I showed you, this article here? So some of the reasons that you should have had in your bullet points then, please, just double check those, add them in green pen if you don't have them. 106,000 jobs were lost in manufacturing and the transport industry between 1961 and 71. And that's partly due to globalization. A lot of manufacturing moved to developing countries. So it's not just unloading all the stuff off the ships, but the things that the ships bring with them, the materials and goods that they bring with them, often went straight into factories that were nearby. But with globalization spreading across the world, a lot of that manufacturing moved away to developing countries. As those warehouses shut down, as we were talking about before, the land becomes derelict. It's not being used. Buildings are being boarded up. Nobody wants to put money into that. It doesn't bring in any investment. And that can lead to poor infrastructure. That, particularly at that time, the warehouses were quite close together. The roads were narrow and winding. It wasn't suitable for having loads of traffic. The housing in that area, these dock workers, they're not particularly wealthy, they work really, really hard, physical jobs, they're labourers. And so the housing in the area is not great, the local wages are not very high, the schools in the area are not great, and the connections to the national grid and the water mains, none of that was fantastic. So all of this is something that needs a boost, it needs regenerating. And along with the job losses, people decided to move out. Tower Hamlets lost over a quarter of its population in this period. And of course, the type of work that they're doing is not reliable. If a ship comes in and they need it unloaded, there's work for you that week. But if there's nothing coming in, then you really can't tell whether you're going to get work. To be honest with you, this casual labour that's unreliable and very competitive is not dissimilar from today's Uber drivers or Deliveroo riders. Having a low-paying job that you have to try and find more work for all the time is very, very challenging. Moving on then, we're going to be looking at the cycle of deprivation. This is not unique to London's Docklands. This is something that happens in a lot of urban areas and has happened in lots of urban areas across the country. But our case study, as you know, is London. So we've been talking about an area of London that's experienced that. Now, in this second task, we're talking about a circular process, something that gets worse and worse and worse, and it kind of feeds in on itself. Sometimes we call this in geography a feedback loop. So what we're saying is, these statements here, they go in kind of a circular pattern. I'm going to ask you to put them in the right order, but I want you to bear in mind that if this green statement up here is the first statement, then the last statement is going to lead to more of this thing up here. So the industry declining and the companies moving away, that last thing needs to lead back to this. I'll show you on your worksheet. So your worksheet looks like this. The cycle of deprivation is here. And what you should be able to see is that once you've put your statements in order, just drag and drop them or copy and paste them from up there, this last statement is going to cycle back around and cause more industry decline and companies moving away. Once you're done with that, I want you to see if you can come up with any social, economic, and environmental problems caused by this deprivation. Remembering, of course, deprivation is a material difference in how much people have. So they may have a lack of access to education, a lack of jobs, a lower income. All of that makes somebody deprived compared to somebody else. So, for instance, if the poorest people are left behind, what social problems might that cause? What economic problems might that cause? What environmental problems might that cause? So this is task 2 and 3, and there's a little challenge here, okay, and you're completing it on your worksheet just as it is here. pause the video for a good 10 minutes, please, and get that sorted for me. Off you go. Okay, so I hope that you didn't find that too hard. We're going to look at some answers now about what problems we might find, but we're going to start off with, of course, the order that these statements go in. So first things first, the industry declines and companies move away. So in this example that we've been discussing, the industry that declined was the Docklands and the manufacturing that came with it. The companies moved away in terms of manufacturing. A lot of those went abroad, became overseas companies. And then the Docklands themselves, they moved further out of London to the east. So large areas of land are left derelict. These are abandoned warehouses, factories, the docks themselves. These huge amounts of land that used to have a purpose that are no longer being used. And because there aren't as many companies in the area, there are fewer jobs, and the area has become less vibrant and interesting, people decide that they don't want to live there anymore. They move away from that crowded and cramped inner city to the growing suburbs on the outer edges of London. But of course, those people that move away are the ones who can afford to move away. It's the poorest people who are left behind. This, of course, is going to give rise to a whole heap of other problems. If it's only the poorest people that are left behind, are they likely to be spending lots of money in local shops? No. Are they likely to be paying high amounts in taxes that are going to help rejuvenate that area? No. And so what happens is that urban environment, it gets even worse. The local council doesn't have enough money from taxes to try and regenerate and rejuvenate that area, to pump some money back into it and invest in it. And so it gets worse and worse gradually. Because there's a lack of investment, people are not maintaining it, the area is getting a little bit, it looks a bit shabbier, people aren't taking care of it, you start to get some more social problems. If the poorest people are left behind, the schools are maybe suffering from a lack of investment, perhaps people struggle to get jobs, perhaps people get lower grades, perhaps crime starts to go up. And all of these things are a problem with a lack of investment. And because that area has now become a bit of a problem, other companies that are thinking, oh, that might be a cheap place to go, are actually thinking, no, we don't want to go there. The crime is too high. The people in the area won't be able to work for us because they don't have the skills. They don't have the education. We'd have to put so much money into it. We're worried about it. So they don't want to come back. And what that means is that we get all the way back up to the top. More and more that area gets worse and worse. Now, this is not something we've just seen in London, as I said before. When we look at the challenges of an urbanising world unit for paper 1, what you will see in that unit is that we're going to look at an example, for instance, Chicago, where urban deprivation and decline have caused huge social inequalities. Or another area like that in Detroit in the USA, experienced huge problems with the decline of the car industry. So what are some of those problems then that we could discuss? Task 3 was to think about what some of those other problems that come with this. When we're talking about poorest people left behind, what kinds of social problems come out of that? What happens when the environment declines even further? So, for instance, we've already mentioned rising crime, and that can include gang crime. If any of you have seen the sort of movie, is it a movie or documentary? Detroit, you can see a huge example of how this urban decline fuels higher gang crime. You get higher levels of antisocial behaviour, whether that's the graffiti and littering that we were talking about before, whether that's things like smashing windows or having noisy parties and raves. Because there's a lack of community spirit, it becomes very difficult. You can get more and more discrimination against the people from those areas. You start to get a stigma around that. People saying, oh, you're from there. And they think they know that there's this declining urban environment, that a lot of people there are poor, that there's high crime. And it comes with a set of judgments that leads to discrimination. So more than just prejudice, but actually discrimination. From an environmental standpoint, or an economic standpoint, you get, of course, higher unemployment. Fewer people have jobs, particularly as these industries move away. Your local shops and services close down. If fewer people have jobs, then fewer people have the money to be buying things from these local shops and services. And you get more people who have to rent their homes. Now, renting your home is not a problem in most scenarios, but in an area where the majority of people are renting, do you think they have as much care, say for instance for their garden, their home, their flat? Do they have as much a sense of responsibility as if maybe you owned that home? If it was really your home, would you be more inclined to take care of it and really push to look after it? Possibly. From an environmental perspective, then, you get a lack of infrastructure and investment, and that looks pretty poor, and you get a rise in litter, dumping of waste, and things like that. Now, this diagram is quite complicated, but it is pretty much the same things I've been discussing already. So I want you to take a moment, please, and to just try and trace these arrows, okay? What you should see here is there's a key on the side. Social things are the green boxes, economic things are the blue boxes, and the orange boxes, are environmental things. What you must realise, and I'm sure you do know this already, is that economic and social factors in geography are very, very often closely linked. When we say we've got high unemployment, in the previous slide I put that in the economic category, but of course unemployment is also a social problem. It affects people's daily lives. So these are very closely linked, they're intertwined, and so it can be difficult sometimes to separate them. So for example, deindustrialization happens, the companies start to fire people, they reduce their workforces, they relocate, and so they can't hire people in that same area. And that leads to two things. The buildings become empty, and that leads to these environmental problems of sort of wasted land, graffiti, abandoning the area, burglaries, vandalism. But also the impact on individuals, on people, and on society. That unemployment then leads to people leaving the area because they can't get a job. The local people have less money to spend, and that leads to greater crime. It leads to less shops and services. People spend less on improving their homes and making sure that they're nice. And even from a mental health perspective, people become resigned, depressed about the situation, and that can lead them to actually have lower aims. They don't look as high and hope for as much as they could imagine. And they may even be willing to accept lower wages so long as they just have a job. And all of this becomes, as you can see here, a huge cycle that causes further problems and increasing decline. So it's like a spiral. As you go down, it circles back around and it gets worse and worse and worse. Now, the opposite can also happen. We can get a spiral of improvement, of regeneration, and that's something we're going to look at in a future lesson. Task 4 then. You've got a couple of statements, and I just want you to practice putting these things in the right categories. So, of these problems that cities face after a period of decline or during a period of decline, which of these are social, which of them are economic, and which of them are environmental? And if you really think that something belongs in more than one category, say for instance social and economic, you can do that. Once you've done the highlighting on your worksheet, I'd like you to decide of those three, which is the worst, which is the most severe. Why do you think that is the worst thing? It might not be, you may have 4 environmental statements on here, but you think they're all not that bad. But the one economic or social statement is really bad. And you can say that as it's more severe, it's more significant perhaps. So pause the video for me, please. You've got 5 minutes or so to do this task. Off you go. Okay, so let's have a little look at what our answers should have been. You should have had about 4 social problems, that the properties themselves have gotten worse, high percentage of overcrowded households. That means that you've got too many people living in them, a lower life expectancy, people living shorter lives, and we've discussed this already in previous lessons, high levels of stress due to poverty, family breakdowns, people arguing, not having jobs. or losing their jobs causes a huge amount of stress. Economic problems, a loss of business and industry, huge unemployment. Very few people can afford to own their own houses or invest any money in that area. And the local authority, and when we say that, we mean like the council or the county, have very few taxes and a lack of investment into the local area. Our environmental problems might be the decay and deprivation of factories. You can get, things like crime growing. You've got a lack of open space sometimes, a lack of green space. A poor state of repair makes the environment really horrible and depressing. You don't have any aspirations from that. And you could end up with high levels of pollution. So, deindustrialization is not the only factor that caused urban decline in inner city London. It is the one I've spent most of this lesson on, but you should also understand that it's more than one thing happening. It's a combination of the fact that inner city London was going into decline, it was going downhill, at the same time as living in the suburbs was looking so nice, the transport networks were improving, you could travel from the edge of the city into the city if you needed to with quite a lot of ease. And this process of suburbanization, a population shift where people wanted to live in the suburbs, have a bit more space, a bit more green, a garden, that kind of thing, grew the city at the edges. And people didn't want to live in the more cramped and close quarters that you find in the inner city. In addition, retail decentralization, so retail is shops, and decentralization means moving away from the centre, is basically saying that we start to get these sort of big out-of-town shopping centres, and that means that people are not just living in the suburbs, but also increasingly being able to spend their money there and actually have less reason to travel into the centre of London. So places like Oxford Street get a huge hit from places that are on the edge of the city that are encouraging people to shop there. Say, for instance, Lakeside Shopping Centre, or in Wembley we have the LDO. And so that shift moves people away from the shopping centres. I'm going to ask you now to look at Caboodle, okay? And particularly on Caboodle, I want you to read pages 180 and 181 and answer the following 3 questions on your worksheet. The 4th question is about completing a table. I've drawn it for you in your worksheet, so I'll just show you your worksheet here. We're looking at this task 5, going to Caboodle, reading these pages, answering 1, 2 questions, and then this table for the 3rd question. So just a reminder then, Caboodle looks like this. Once you're logged in with your school email address, you just click on the textbook and it will open itself up, and you can navigate to the correct page just by typing the page number in the bottom down here. So where it says go to page, you can type the number in here, 180. I'm already here. So this is the page that I would like you to read, please. All about the sort of East End of London and how things have changed. It's a bit about out-of-town shopping centres, retail parks and business parks. And then answering questions 2, 3 and 4, please, in that worksheet, which look like this. Pause the video. This is going to take you a good 10 minutes at least. Off you go. So, looking at some answers then to these questions. Question 2, your answer needs to talk about losses of jobs, crime increasing, people moving away from the city. Yes, these are the same things we've talked about already, but this is for you to put them in your own words. What are those impacts? Question 3, one thing that helps the city grow at the edges is the development of the London Underground. And it allowed people to live much further out of the city and still to work in London and come back every day by train for work. And this process is getting even better, not just because of the underground network, but surface rail, so things like the DLR and better road networks, all contribute to London's sort of all contribute to London's growing edges. It spreads out at the edges. So, some advantages and disadvantages of out-of-town shopping versus city centre shopping. Okay, we're thinking the LDO versus Oxford Street. Okay, And there's a couple of advantages here. Please take your green pen, or rather change the color of your typing on your worksheet to green so that you can correct your answers. We're moving on now to our final task today, which is, of course, exam question practice. I know you do hate this, but we do need to practice these things because they're an important skill. And I don't want you to feel rusty on it, even though your content is going to be amazing. I don't want you to feel shy and rusty on these things. So, a short four-mark question here. Explain why many UK cities are experiencing more growth at the edges than in their centres. Okay, this is a 4-mark question. So before we go any further, I want you to tell me what the command word is and the key words. The command word is important, but the key words, what is it we need to mention? Hopefully you've said explain means you need to tell me why something's happening and how it's happening. We need to talk about growth at city edges compared with the centre, okay? And we want to make 2 points and develop them. That's what's going to get me my 4 marks. We're going to make 2 reasons why the edges of the city are growing and explain those a little bit more. Use the word because, use the word therefore. So what things could we say here? Well, we've already discussed it. You have the answers. We're saying transport networks improved hugely and that allowed people to live further out. And 2, why did people want to live further out? Well, deindustrialization in the centre, a lack of jobs, or a poor urban environment that they didn't enjoy compared with greener, more space, all of the rest at the edges. Pause the video, write your 4-mark answer, make sure your points are fully developed, practice the skill. You've got 4 minutes, off you go. Okay, so that question then. We've had a look at it, let's look at some answers. So we've said retail parks opening up on the edge of cities, we just discussed that. The land there is cheaper and is more available. See here, our key word because, and discussing why that's the case. Shops can have larger floor space. Think of somewhere like IKEA or Costco. You can't have that in the centre of town. And they can give people free parking too. Houses are built on the edges of cities as people prefer to have gardens, larger homes, more space. And that's possible because they've got good transport links, making it easy to get into the city centre. Better transport is also a cause of that. So you've got this working in both directions. You've got first, houses are built at the edges, and that means that the easy transport makes it attractive. And equally, having better transport means that the edges of the city are better connected to the central business district, and that lets people live in the suburbs and work in the city, and it improves their quality of life. This is a huge motivating factor for people. So if you didn't get some of those points, or you feel like, okay, I made some of those points, but I could have developed them a bit more, go back, edit your answer, improve it to the best of your ability, please. Finally then, a quick plenary. Could you come up with some true or false statements for your classmates to answer? If I get some good ones of these, I'm going to use them in next week's quiz, and I hope that acts as motivation, because you should be starting to pick up on some particular key points that you should know off the top of your head.